"You don't belong here, Granny. This isn't a retirement home field trip. The tour's the other way. Way, the other way." The words came down the brow before anything else, before the scene had a chance to settle, before anyone had bothered to tell the old woman she was a problem. They came from a young man in a white hat at the top of the gangway, and they were meant to carry. They carried. It was a bright Saturday on a Navy pier, the kind of morning the fleet keeps for the public. A guided missile destroyer lay alongside, 450 feet of haze-gray steel, with her lifelines dressed, and her decks scrubbed, and a banner run out along the pier welcoming families aboard. Children pointed at the 5-inch gun. Fathers read the hull number off the bow and said it aloud to sons who already knew it. Somewhere, a public address speaker was playing something patriotic and thin. The air smelled of salt and fresh paint and the faint tar of new line, and the water between the ship and the pier moved with a slow, oiled patience, the way harbor water always does, lifting and settling the camels between the hull and the pilings. At the foot of the brow stood an old woman in a plain red jacket. She was perhaps 75, small and square-shouldered, with regular gray hair combed back plain, and a face that had been out in the weather for most of a lifetime. She held her hands folded in front of her. She did not fidget. She did not look at the young man who had just called her Granny in front of 40 strangers. She looked at the ship. The young man was boatswain's mate, second class, Trent Mabry, 24 years old, standing the brow watch with the particular confidence of a sailor who has an audience and no chief within arm's reach. He had the watch belt on, and the sidearm he was proud of, and a clipboard of nothing important, and 2 junior sailors stood behind him, and they had laughed at his first line, and that was all the reason he needed to keep going. The old woman let 3 families pass her and go up ahead. She could have gone. There was room on the brow, and her turn had come and gone twice over. She simply waited, hands folded, as if her turn had a shape she could feel, and she was not going to take anyone else's. She stood with the stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting for the sea to give something back. Her eyes moved along the waterline. They found the draft marks near the bow and read them without hurry. They followed the anchor chain up through the hawse pipe and along the forecastle to the bullnose, and they moved aft, along the flare of the hull, to the boat davits and the flight deck and back. They were not the eyes of a tourist deciding whether a ship was big. They were the eyes of someone taking a measurement, checking a sum, the way an old carpenter cannot walk into a room without reading the joinery. At the top of the brow, past Mabry's shoulder, a different man was watching. Senior Chief Boatswain's mate Walt Sturgis, 61 years old, stood the quarterdeck watch supervisor's slot with a clipboard in one hand and 40 years of ships behind his eyes, and he had just gone quiet in the middle of a sentence. He had come up through the deck force when the deck force still spliced its own line, and he had stood more brows than he could count, in more ports than he could name, and he had piped a great many people aboard. The senior chief knew the difference between someone looking at a ship and someone counting her the way a mother counts children. The old woman at the foot of his brow was counting. He did not yet know why the sight of it had reached in and set a hand on the back of his neck. He only knew that it had. "You hear me, sweetheart?" Mabry called down, warmer now, playing it for the crowd. "You look a little turned around. You want me to get somebody to help you find your bus?" The old woman did not answer. She set one hand on the brow rail, the cool aluminum of it, and she stepped up. And Mabry moved to block her. He came down 2 steps and put himself in the middle of the brow, filling it, arms loose, smiling the smile of a man who has decided a thing is funny and expects the world to agree. "Whoa. Easy now." He tapped the rail with the flat of his hand. "This is a warship, ma'am. It's not real safe for somebody your age. You want to mind the ramp." The old woman looked at him for the first time. "It's a brow," she said, "not a ramp." Her voice was low and even and entirely unbothered. The correction offered the way you might tell a stranger he had dropped a glove. And I've been up worse in a heavier sea. For a half-second, Mabry had nothing at all. Then he laughed, because laughing was easier than the small, cold thing that had just walked across the back of his neck, the same way it had walked across Sturgis's. "Okay," he said, turning to his sailors. "We got ourselves a sea-story granny. I love it. I love her." Behind him, one man did not laugh. Seaman apprentice Danny Ackley, 19 years old and 3 weeks aboard, stood at the top of the brow with his hands at his sides and his stomach unhappy. He did not know the old woman. He knew only that something was wrong with the way this was going, the way you know a swell is wrong before it lifts the deck under you. He had grown up being told to give up his seat to gray hair, to carry the groceries, to say ma'am and mean it. And he was watching a man in his own uniform do the opposite in front of children, and he did not have the rank or the nerve to stop it, and the not having sat in him like a swallowed stone. Sturgis came down 2 steps of his own. He had heard the old woman say brow, not ramp, and he had heard the way she said it, not correcting a child, but stating a fact of the world, the way a person states a fact they have known so long they have forgotten it was ever learned. Sailors learn that word in their first week and use it every day for 30 years, and it wears into them until it is not a word anymore, but a reflex. She had it. And now, close, he saw the pin. It sat at her collar, small and tarnished to a dull silver, worn thin at one edge by a thumb that had touched it 10,000 times. It was not a flag pin. It was not a veterans organization's enamel button, not a ship's reunion souvenir, not the kind of thing the gift shop 2 blocks up sold to tourists. It was older than all of that, and quieter, and Sturgis's eye snagged on it and would not come loose. He could not place it yet, not fully, not from 6 feet in bad light. But his spine had straightened without his telling it to, and the clipboard had gone still in his hand. The old woman had already looked away from Mabry, back to the ship. She spoke again, half to herself, the way a person reads a page aloud without meaning to. "She's riding a few inches down by the stern," she said quietly. "You've taken on weight after you didn't have this morning. Stores, maybe. Water." A pause, an appraising tilt of the head. "That's a good chalk, though. And your camels are dressed proper. Somebody down here keeps your ground tackle honest. That's a bosun who cares." She read the draft marks the way other people read a clock. Ackley heard it and stared. Mabry heard it and did not know for certain what a chalk was, or a camel, and he hated, for one bright instant, that he did not, and the hating made him louder. "All right." He stepped square into her path again, and the smile had gone thin at the edges. "Fun's over. Open house is closed. For you." The old woman did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She did not look around for someone to appeal to. She simply stood where she was, hands folded, and waited, as if his sentence were a squall that would blow through and leave the sky where it had found it. Up on the quarterdeck, Walt Sturgis turned to Ackley and said, low and fast, "Hold the watch. Whatever he does, you do not let anybody put hands on that woman." "Clear." And without waiting for the answer, he stepped off toward the quarterdeck phone, moving quicker than a man his age had any business moving, one hand already going up to loosen the top button of his collar, as though the morning had gotten close. By now the little scene had drawn a crowd, the way a raised voice on a quiet pier always will. 2 more junior sailors drifted over from the base of the gun mount, drawn by the laughter. A knot of civilians slowed, half wanting to see, half ashamed to want it. A teenager filmed a seagull, and then, sensing better content, turned the phone toward the brow. Mabry felt the size of his audience change, and, the way a certain kind of young man always will, he grew to fit it. "Ladies and gentlemen," He spread a hand toward the old woman like a showman presenting a prize. "We got ourselves an admiral. I didn't recognize her at first. My apologies, Admiral." He threw a sloppy salute, fingers loose, elbow wrong, the kind of salute that would have earned him a week of misery in boot camp. "Permission to come aboard? Oh, that's right. Denied." The sailors laughed. A civilian father winced and drew his small daughter back a step, embarrassed on the old woman's behalf. The way decent people are embarrassed by cruelty, they cannot quite bring themselves to interrupt. Off to one side of the crowd, an old man in a ball cap had stopped walking. He was a stranger to everyone there, a grandfather who had come down to the pier to show his grandson a warship, and he had heard the word "admiral" thrown as an insult, and he had turned to look, and now he was not looking at the joke. He was looking at the woman. He had spent 20 years in the fleet himself, a long time ago, and he could not have told you what he was seeing, only that he had seen it a handful of times in his life, and that it had always, every time, been standing very still while louder men made noise around it. He put a hand on his grandson's shoulder and said quietly, "Watch this. Just watch." He did not know what he was promising the boy. He only knew a thing was coming. The old woman took the nickname the way she had taken everything else. She did not flinch at it. She looked past Mabry's shoulder at the superstructure, at the mast, at the array faces of the radars, at the antennas, and she went on cataloging, quietly, privately, a whole ship going into her the way a coastline goes into a navigator. She said nothing. That was the thing that goaded him, though he could never have named it. A person who fights back can be beaten and made small in front of a crowd. A person who is simply, quietly, unmovingly, there gives you nothing to push against. And the longer you push against nothing, the more the crowd stops watching the nothing and starts watching you. Mabry. It was Ackley, low from the top of the brow. "Ease up, man. Come on. That's somebody's grandmother." Mabry turned. "You got something you want to say, airman?" He used the wrong rate on purpose to file the boy back down where he belonged. "You want to stand this watch, or you want to go find some bright work to polish till I'm done?" Ackley's ears went red. He held the watch. He said nothing more, and hated that he said nothing more, and filed the hating away with the rest of it. At the quarterdeck phone, Sturgis had the petty officer of the watch by the sleeve. "Get word to the command master chief. Now, not after your coffee." His voice was quiet and flat, and left no room. "Tell him there's a lady standing at the foot of our brow that he is going to want his own eyes on. Tell him one of ours has already put his mouth all over her, and I would dearly like to get somebody down there before he puts his hands on her, too." He glanced back down the brow at the small red figure standing in the middle of the growing crowd, like a piling in a running current, water breaking around her, herself unmoved. "And tell him to hurry." The petty officer of the watch heard the words, "Command Master Chief," in that particular tone, from that particular senior chief, and he did not ask a single question. He moved. If you have ever stood in a crowd and watched the young forget what the old once paid, watched good people look away because it was easier than stepping in, then stay with this one all the way to the end. And subscribe to the Veteran Vault, because these are the stories that deserve the room. Down on the pier, Mabry had decided how it would end, and having decided, he wanted it over. "Okay, here's what's going to happen," he told the old woman, loud enough for the whole crowd, thumbing the radio on his belt, as though he had a security detachment on the other end of it. "You don't move along right now. I get base security down here, and they walk you off this pier by the arm. That what you want? At your age? To be a scene? To get walked off in front of all these nice families?" The old woman turned her head and looked at him, and for the first time there was something in her face that was not simply patience. It was not fear. It was closer to sadness, the specific, worn sadness of a person who has watched the young make the same mistake for 50 years and has never once enjoyed being proven right about it. "I came a long way to see this ship," she said. "I'll wait my turn." "Your turn is over. Then I'll wait for the next one." He had run out of jokes, and a young man who has run out of jokes in front of a crowd will very often reach next for his hands. She set her palm on the rail again. She stepped up onto the brow, one deliberate step, and her weight came down square and low, the way a person's weight comes down when they have spent years learning to move on a deck that will not hold still, a body that knows the sea even standing on concrete. And Mowbray planted his hand, flat on her shoulder, and shoved. It was not a tap. It was not a guiding hand. It was a shove with the shoulder behind it, the kind of shove a man uses on another man in a bar, and it sent the old woman back down the 2 steps she had climbed. She came off the brow and onto the pier, and her hand found the rail, and she rode the shove down and set her feet. She did not stumble the way the old are supposed to stumble. She rode it down and set her feet, and then she looked at him the way the sea looks at a small boat, without malice, without hurry, and without the smallest doubt about how the contest ends. A woman in the crowd said, "Hey!" Sharp. The father with the small daughter said, "Whoa! Hey, that's not," and could not finish it. A phone that had been filming a seagull turned itself sideways and steadied on the brow, and its little red light was the only thing on that pier that was in a hurry. For one long beat, the old woman stayed where she was, one hand on the rail, feet planted, breathing slow and even, as if the shove had been a wave she had let break over her and pass. Then she straightened. She reached up and settled her red jacket back onto her shoulders, unhurried, deliberate, the way a person squares a uniform after inspection, and the small motion pulled her collar flat. And the tarnished pin caught the sun. Sturgis was coming back down the brow at that exact moment, and he saw it clean, full in the light, no more than 6 feet off. It was a cross. Worn to dull silver at the edges, the ribbon behind it faded to a color that had once been dark blue bordered white, the whole thing small and modest and unspeakable. He knew it. Every man who has spent 40 years around the fleet knows it on sight, the way you know a face you have only ever seen in a framed photograph on a bulkhead. It is not given for a good career or a long one. It is given for one specific kind of afternoon, the second highest thing the Navy has to give a human being for valor, and it is very often handed to a family in a quiet room instead of to the sailor, because the sailor is not there to take it. The Navy Cross. 40 years he had waited to be wrong about a thing like this, to see the pin and have it turn out to be a look-alike, a costume piece, an honest mistake. He was not wrong. Wrong was not in the woman's spine, or her hands, or the way she read his ship. Sturgis's breath went out of him in the shape of a word he didn't say aloud. He looked at the old woman's scarred hands, at her wrists, at the flat, calm plane of her face, and the whole morning rearranged itself around the little cross at her collar, the way iron filings rearrange around a magnet you did not know was under the paper. He turned and went for the quarterdeck faster than before, and his hand was already reaching for the panel that would put a single voice over the entire length of the ship. And the story owes you, now, the night that pin was earned. To find it, we have to leave this bright pier and this bright morning and go down 35 years and 40 feet into black water. The Northern Persian Gulf, 1991. Operation Desert Storm. A destroyer sat dead in the water in the dark, and she could not move because there was a mine against her hull. It was a moored contact mine, an old, ugly iron sphere the size of a wrecking ball, studded around its curve with horns, and the tide and a fouled cable had walked it in until it lay against the ship's plating below the waterline. The horns were the trigger. Bend one of those soft lead horns hard enough against the casing, and the whole thing would let go and open the ship like a tin can along a bad seam. She could not go forward. She could not back down. She could not so much as turn her screws for fear the wash would set the thing swinging against her side. She could only sit in the black anchorage and radio for the one kind of help that exists in the world for this. The help was Lieutenant Commander Nadine Voss and her detachment. She was 39 years old that year, an explosive ordnance disposal and salvage diving officer with more hours underwater than most men had behind a desk. And when the tasking came over the net, she was already pulling on her gear before the voice on the other end had finished the coordinates. She had 2 divers going down with her. The lead was Petty Officer First Class Curtis Dunmore, 26, a big steady kid from a landlocked town 1,000 miles from any ocean, who had somehow become the finest working diver she had ever put in the water, and who could make a frightened boat crew laugh with one dry sentence at the exact moment they needed it most. "So we're going to go down and pet the mine," Dunmore said, in the red light, checking her rig by feel, "because you learn to trust your hands over your eyes down there." "Great. Love petting the mine, ma'am. Favorite part of the job. Tell my mother I died doing what I hated slightly less than paperwork." "You keep your hands exactly where I put them," Voss said, "and you talk to me the whole way down, every foot." "I always talk to you the whole way down. It's my single best quality. Ask anybody." They went over the side into water, so black it had no top and no bottom, only the cold and the pull of the current dragging at them like a hand. 800 meters of current running through that anchorage, 40 feet down to the mine, 1 mine, 2 divers, and no dive light they could afford to keep burning, because light travels in water, and light can be seen, and there were people on the far shore who would very much have liked to know exactly where the American divers were working. Voss went down the descent line by touch, hand over hand, counting. She talked Dunmore onto the mine the way you talk a spooked animal onto your palm. Slow, low, every single word a fact, and nothing but a fact. No fear allowed into the voice, because fear travels down a comm line faster than anything. She found the casing with her flat hand worse, felt the cold, pitted iron of it, felt the horns standing off the curve like the broken stubs of branches, mapped the whole ugly shape of it in the dark with her fingertips. And then, 40 feet down, in a current, by touch alone, she began to take it apart. She would remember the count of it for the rest of her life, the pull of the current trying to walk her off her handhold, the cold that got down into the joints of the fingers and made them slow and stupid, so that every motion had to be told to the hand twice. The single inch of black water between the back of her wrist and a horn that would end them both. Dunmore's breath in her ear over the comm. Steady, steady. A joke held behind his teeth, because even he knew this was not the moment to spend it. There is a particular loneliness to that kind of work that no one on the surface ever understands. Above her, 40 feet up, there was a whole ship, hundreds of men in their racks, cooks and gunners, and boys who had lied about their ages, every one of them alive at that moment, because 2 people were awake in the cold under them, doing something with their hands that could not be undone if it went wrong. None of those men would ever know. That was the trade. You went down into the dark so that people who would never learn your name got to keep waking up, and if you did the job exactly right, the reward was that absolutely nothing happened, and the ship sailed on in the morning, and no one told the story because there was no story to tell. She had made her peace with that a long time before that night. What she had not made her peace with, what she would never make her peace with, was the other half of the trade. That some nights the sea decided the price for all that nothing was one of your own, and it did not ask you first, and it did not give the one back. She talked Dunmore through the last of it a quarter-inch at a time. She named each thing to him as she touched it, so that if her hands failed, his would know where to take over. That was the discipline. 2 divers, 1 mind, no light. And then it was done. The render safe held. The mine was safe. The ship above them, and every sleeping sailor in her, could live to see the morning. And that was the moment the sea reached out and took its price. It was not the mine. The mine was beaten. It was the cable. The old fouled mooring cable that had walked the mine in, still under tension in the dark, still loaded. And when the last of the weight came off it, it parted, and it whipped through the black water faster than thought, and it caught Dunmore across the body, and it hurt him, badly, somewhere, and somehow the dark would not let her see. She got a hand on him. She got a full fist into the harness at the back of his rig, and she did not let go. She brought him up through 40 feet of black water, with the current trying the whole way to take him out of her hand, and her own lungs burning against the ascent, hand over hand up the line. And she talked to him the entire way, even after he had stopped talking back, because talking to him the whole way down had been the promise, and if the way down had a promise, then the way up did too. And she was not a person who broke a promise to a diver on a line. She got him to the surface. She got him up onto the deck under the lights, and the shouting and the hands reaching down. He did not live to see the sun come up over that anchorage. They gave her the Navy Cross for the mine, for the ship full of men who never once in their lives knew how close the black water had come to them that night, who went home and married and grew old and told their grandchildren about the Gulf without ever knowing her name. She stood at attention for the medal because she was ordered to stand. But she never, in the 35 years after, counted the mine. They gave her the cross for the mine. She only ever counted the man. And on a bright pier 35 years later, the small tarnished cross that carried all of that inside it sat at the collar of an old woman in a red jacket, and a senior chief's hand was closing on the quarterdeck panel, and a boy who did not know one word of any of it still had his eyes on her, winding himself up to make one more mistake. Sturgis did not reach for the 1MC first. 40 years had taught him the order of things. He found Command Master Chief Cyrus Loomis coming out of the chief's mess with a coffee in his hand, and he stopped him with one sentence. "Master Chief, there is a Navy Cross standing at the foot of our brow, and one of ours just put his hands on her." Loomis set the coffee down on the nearest flat surface without looking at it. "You're sure of the pin?" "I stood 2 feet off it in full sun. I'm sure of the pin, and I'm sure of the woman. She read our draft marks and called our chalk. She's one of ours, Master Chief, from a long way back, and she came to our brow, and Mabry shoved her down it." That was all it took. Loomis was a man who had spent 30 years learning which sentences to move fast for, and this was one of them. He took Sturgis up to the in-port cabin himself, and he knocked once, and he put the thing in front of Commander Danforth in fewer words than Sturgis would have used. Danforth was on his feet before the sentence finished. "Her name?" "Voss, sir," Sturgis said. "Captain Nadine Voss. Navy Cross, the Gulf, 91. The mine off the—" He did not have to finish it. He could see in the commander's face that the name had landed somewhere deep, that Danforth had read the citation once as a young officer and never quite put it down. "On my brow," Danforth said. It was not a question. He was already reaching for his cover. "Muster the side, Master Chief. Full honors. Man the rail. And get me her name and her decoration for the 1MC. Exact. I will not have it said wrong today of all days." He looked at Sturgis. "And the sailor who touched her does not leave this ship." "No, sir," Loomis said. "He does not." Because Mabry, down on the pier, had felt something in the morning change, and he did not understand what. And a young man who feels control sliding out from under him will very often grab for it with both hands at once. Sturgis was gone, up the brow and out of sight. The crowd had gone quiet in a way Mabry read as hostile rather than as afraid. The old woman was still standing there, unbroken, having ridden his shove down and set her feet and looked at him like weather. And the not going away of her was a personal thing now, an insult to him specifically, in front of everyone. He needed her gone. He needed it finished. He needed to be, in front of all these staring people, the man in charge of this brow that he had been given for 4 hours on a Saturday. That's it. He came down off the brow onto the pier and took the old woman by the arm. You're done. Off the pier. Before I have to make it official. He closed his hand around her forearm through the sleeve of the red jacket, and he pulled. The sleeve rode up as he pulled, and for a moment her wrist was bare in the sunlight, and it was not the soft, powdered wrist of somebody's idea of a grandmother. It was scarred. Old white scars laid over old brown weathering. The wrist of a hand that had worked in cold water and cut itself open on barnacled iron and healed and gone right back down again the next day. Higher on the forearm, faded, almost back into the skin, was the ghost of a unit mark she had put there as a young woman who had been absolutely certain she would never live to be old. The old woman let him hold her arm. Then, without any force at all, no jerk, no twist, no drama, she set her feet, and she did not move. He was pulling on something that had once pulled a 200-pound man up through 40 feet of black water against a running current, and would not let go. It did not move for Trent Mabry either. He pulled harder and got nothing, and the getting nothing frightened him in a place under his anger, and the fright turned his face ugly. Ackley crossed the brow in 3 fast steps and put himself between them, one hand up flat toward his own shipmate, his back to the old woman. Mabry, stop. Let go of her arm, right now. His voice cracked clean in the middle of it, and he did not care that it cracked, and that not caring was the first grown thing he had done all day. And over Mabry's shoulder, though he could not yet feel it, the whole ship had begun to turn. Along the lifelines, sailors were appearing, not drifting over to gawk, falling in. At even intervals, facing outboard, spacing themselves down the length of the deck, the way men space themselves when an order has come down through the chain that they do not fully understand yet, but will not dream of questioning. The quarterdeck above was filling with khaki, chiefs and officers, arriving at a walk that was almost a run and was not quite allowed to be one. And somewhere up there, a boatswain's pipe had come out of a pocket on its long chain and was rising toward a mouth. The first high silver note of it climbed out across the pier. Mabry half turned toward the sound, his hand still locked on the old woman's arm, and the 1MC clicked live with a hiss that every soul on that pier felt in their back teeth, and a name was about to go out over the whole length and height of the ship. Commander Hugh Danforth came down the brow in his cover. He was 43 years old, the commanding officer of that ship, and he had not run, because a captain does not run on his own quarterdeck in front of his crew and the public. But he had come down fast, and the khaki had parted in front of him, and the crowd on the pier felt the sheer gravity of who he was before a single person told them a thing. He walked past boatswain's mate Mabry, as though Mabry were a stanchion, a fitting, a part of the ship. He did not look at him. Not yet. There would be a time for looking at him, and it would keep. He stopped in front of the old woman in the red jacket, and he came to attention, and he saluted her, and he held it. Captain Voss. His voice was pitched to carry the length of the deck, and it carried. This ship has been waiting a very long time to have you aboard. With your permission, ma'am. The pier went so quiet that you could hear the harbor water working the pilings under the brow, slap and suck and slap. Behind the commander, Senior Chief Sturgis brought the pipe to his lips and piped the side. The long, climbing, falling, sea-old call that the Navy has used to bring its own across a brow since before any flag on that pier had a country under it. Side boys formed at the head of the brow in two facing ranks, snapped into place by a word no one on the pier had heard given, and down the whole 450-foot length of the ship the crew manned the rail, a line of white hats standing against the blue sky, coming to attention as one single body with one single sound. And the one MC spoke, flat and formal and final, the voice of the entire ship at once. Navy Cross, arriving. Out at the edge of the crowd, the old man in the ball cap took his own cap off and held it over his chest, and beside him, his grandson copied him without being told, and neither of them said a word. He had told the boy to watch. He had not known when he said it that he was promising him this. Mabry's face went through it one stage at a time, and the whole crowd watched it happen to him. First the confusion, because Admiral had been a joke, and Granny had been a joke, and jokes do not get piped aboard United States warships. Then disbelief, plain on him as the commanding officer of that warship stood at rigid attention and held a salute for the confused old woman that he, Mabry, had shoved down a brow 20 minutes ago. Then recognition, coming up slow and terrible behind his eyes, as they found the small tarnished cross at her collar, and some sailor's memory of a training slide finally told him what it was, and what it cost, and what it meant. Then horror, flat, total, drowning horror, as every separate piece of the last half hour came back to him all at once, rearranged, and he understood exactly what he had done, and exactly who had watched him do it, and exactly how little of his life would be enough to undo it. His hand came off her arm as though the sleeve had turned to fire under it. He stepped back and back again, until the small of his back met the lifeline and stopped him, and there was nowhere left to go. The old woman did not look at him. She looked at Commander Danforth, and she returned his courtesy with a single small, precise inclination of her head, the nod of one professional to another across 40 years of the same hard trade. And then, and only then, she turned her head and answered the boy who had shoved her, and her voice was quiet, and in the silence, it reached every corner of that pier. "I told you," she said. "I'd been up worse, in a heavier sea." She set her hand on the brow rail. This time, no one on the earth was going to stop her. She walked up the brow between two ranks of side boys standing rigid, past the climbing call of the pipe and the manned rail and the whole ship holding its breath for her, and boatswain's mate second-class Trent Mabry was left standing on the concrete in the exact middle of the silence he had built with his own mouth and his own hands, with a phone somewhere still filming, and nothing at all left to say. What happened to Mabry happened the way it ought to have happened, through his own chain, and not through the woman he had wronged. Command Master Chief Cyrus Loomis was waiting for him just inside the lifelines, 49 years old, and built like a bollard, and he did not raise his voice, because men like Loomis have not needed to raise their voices since somewhere around the turn of the century. He took the boatswain's mate by the elbow, out of the crowd's line of sight, behind the great gray box of the gun mount, and he relieved him of the watch on the spot with 4 quiet words. "You put your hands," Loomis said, "on a Navy cross." He let it sit there in the air between them until Mabry's face told him it had landed all the way down. "You shoved a woman who went into the black water in 91, so that a whole ship full of men could wake up the next morning and not know how close they came. You did it in that uniform, on your own quarterdeck, in front of civilians and children, and a phone's got every second of it." He let that sit too. You are going to answer for every piece of that, in front of people a good deal less friendly than me. And you are going to spend a long, long time earning back the right to stand a brow on my ship. Do you read me, sailor? Yes, Master Chief. It was hardly more than a breath. Then you stand right there, and you square yourself away, and you do not move until I come back for you. Up on the quarterdeck, in the shade of the superstructure, Commander Danforth had walked the old woman out of the sun and asked her, quietly, out of the crowd's hearing, how she would like the matter handled. It was, in plain truth, her call, and no one else's now. A single word from a Navy Cross recipient about a sailor who had laid hands on her on a public pier would end that sailor's career inside of a week, and both of them knew it. Nadine Voss looked out through the lifelines at the bright water for a moment before she answered. He's a young man who was never taught, she said at last. That's the whole of it. Nobody ever put a hand on that boy's shoulder and told him what that rail behind him is for, or whose feet have come up this brow before his, or that the tired old woman he can't be troubled with just might have paid, once, for the deck he's standing on so proud. She turned back from the water to the commander. So teach him. Don't break him. That is the only thing I have ever wanted anyone to do for the young ones. Teach him, and give him the years to grow into the kind of man who'd have offered an old woman his arm at the bottom of a brow instead of the flat of his hand. Danforth held her eye for a long moment, and then he nodded once, because it was the right answer, and he had hoped, without quite letting himself expect it, that she would be the kind to give it. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Subscribe to the veteran vault, and let this old woman's story find the people who still need to hear it. There was one more thing she asked for, and it surprised him. She asked that the boy walk her the rest of the way. So they brought Trent Mabry up from behind the gun mount, pale and unsteady on his own 2 feet. And the old woman looked at him with no anger anywhere in her face, only that same worn, patient sadness, and she held out her arm to him. Well, she said, are you going to help an old woman to the rail, or not? He offered his arm the way a man offers a hand, down into deep water in the dark, afraid of what might be under the surface to take it. She took it, and her grip was light and dry and certain. And boatswain's mate, second class Trent Mabry, walked Captain Nadine Voss, Navy Cross, slowly down the length of his own ship to the lifelines, in front of the entire manned rail. And it was the first genuinely useful thing he had done all morning, and by the set of his face, he knew it. Danny Ackley watched the two of them go, the boy who had never once laughed, and something in his own face settled into a shape that it would hold for the rest of a long career. At the rail, she let go of Mabry's arm and stood on her own, and looked out over the harbor, the bright, broken chop of it, the other gray ships along the pier, the gulls wheeling and complaining over the water. Commander, she said, without turning around. There was a diver with me that night, Petty Officer First Class Curtis Dunmore, 26 years old. He rendered that mine safe with his own 2 hands, in the dark, by feel, and on the way back, up the sea reached out and took him, and I had a fist in his harness the whole way, and I still could not stop it. She was quiet for a moment, the water moving below her. They gave me the cross for the mine. I've worn it 35 years, and I have never one time thought about the mine. I think about him. I came down here today because this ship is the same class as the one we saved, near enough, and I wanted to stand on a deck, like the deck that was full of men who got to grow old. Because he did not. She reached up and touched the small, tarnished cross at her collar. Once, with a thumb that had touched it 10,000 times over 35 years. He's the one who belonged here, she said, very quietly. I only ever came to stand where he would have stood. Down the deck, along the manned rail, Danny Ackley stood his place among the white hats, with his chin up and his eyes wet, and did not let one thing show on his face, because he had learned, in the space of a single morning, that this was what the uniform was actually for, not the sidearm and the swagger and the 4 hours of feeling important on a Saturday. This, standing a rail for someone who had gone into the dark for strangers and come back up carrying a friend she could not save. He would carry the memory of it up through every rank he ever made, and years later, when he was the old salt on some other quarterdeck, and a young sailor got loud with someone small and quiet at the foot of a brow, he would already be moving before the second sentence was out, because he had seen, once, exactly what a person like that could turn out to be, and he would never again make the mistake of assuming he could tell by looking. Commander Hugh Danforth said nothing, because there was nothing in the language to add to it, and the two of them stood at the rail while the manned ranks held their line down the length of the ship and the harbor water moved below, an old woman and a ship's captain, and one name held quiet and steady against 40 years of tide. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.